So my name is Pat Carrabré. I'm the director of the School of Music here at UBC and the director of the Chan Center. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam people and that we are very fortunate at UBC to have a strong working relationship with them as we move towards our educational goals and collaborate on protecting this land. We're gathered right now for a session that's entitled Building Digital Tools for Music Scholarship. And I'll introduce our presenters in a second, but I just wanted to give Vicky, our volunteer, a chance to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Pat. My name is Vicky. I'm the volunteer for this session, and I'm here for assistance. I'll be collecting the questions for the Q&A portion of the session. If you do have a question for one or all of the panelists, feel free to pop it in the chat box at any time during the presentation. You can also send me a private message if you have questions or if you need technical assistance, and I'll do my best to help out.
Thanks, Vicky. So we have a number of presenters today. They have a very organized presentation around this idea of building digital tools in music research, such as early music and the Journal of Musicology, and a forthcoming monograph and edited collection. Then we have Marcin Konik, who's the head of the library department at the Fryderyk Chopin Institute in Warsaw. His doctoral dissertation tracks cosmological threads in medieval treatises on music theory. He's had internships at the Jacobs School, Indiana University, and the music department at Stanford University. So his research focuses on issues of computerized music analysis, music databases, and digitization projects. Then we have Daniel Shanahan, who's an associate professor at Ohio State University, and prior to that post, he was director of the Music Cognition and Computational Lab at Louisiana State University. And finally, Craig Sapp, who's a researcher at the Packard Humanities Institute, Center for Computer-Assisted Research in Humanities, as well as an adjunct professor at Stanford University. So I think you'll see there's a theme here. He has a PhD in computer-based music and acoustics from Stanford, master's in composition and piano performance from University of Virginia, and is also taught at the Peabody Conservatory. So we have an excellent, outstanding group of presenters who are going to look at a number of projects that use these for music teaching, for discussions, building community, and a number of others. So I will turn it over to our presenter.
Well, thanks so much to Ev, who I think might not be able to be here, to Mary, Pat, Vicky, and to the conference organizers. It's a pleasure to non-corporeally be with you. Since 2010, the Josquin Research Project has made accessible a corpus of music from the age of Donatello and Leonardo. Music that circulates in gorgeous books like this, a songbook from the 1470s that when closed is in the shape of a heart. And like this, a book of sacred music from around 1500. Broadly speaking, we're talking about what is commonly referred to as the Renaissance in music, a new style that emerged around 1440 and underwent considerable change over the ensuing decades. Our center of gravity is the composer Josquin des Prez, born around 1450, whose quincentenary will be next year. As you can like music from the 15th and early 16th centuries. The homepage shows repertoire recently added to the database, along with a sample work that changes every time you visit the site. Now, here is another example of the sort of elegant manuscripts in which these pieces circulate, a Kyrie from a polyphonic mass. Notice how the four voices are notated in the four quadrants on the page. These are what these big initials are about, making life very easy for the singers, but not so easy for modern analysts who want to see the voices aligned vertically. A core problem is that modern editors have taken vastly different approaches. Here is this same music in three unhelpfully heterogeneous editions. Considering how cumbersome it is to compare these examples, you can imagine how hard it is to compare different pieces edited in such divergent ways. And so Josquin Research Project scores are all in a uniform format like this one, so as to facilitate one-to-one comparison with the original sources. Now, maybe you haven't heard much Renaissance polyphony. To give you a sense for what this music sounds like, and this might be an unfamiliar idea to some of you, how exciting it can be, I'll play the excerpt shown here. The central aim of the JRP is to make this music accessible. If I click up here on Browse, I'm taken to a page that shows all the composers whose music is on offer. From here, I can do things like browse all the secular songs in the repertory. Here is a list of results, beginning with anonymous songs and showing the titles and number of voices, and allowing you to view complete scores of every work or listen to MP3s. For each piece, we've created a dedicated work page. So if I select the song À cheval, to horse every man to his horse, I'm taken to a work page that shows, among other things, the beginning of the song in modern notation. But the JRP isn't just a tool for browsing scores, you can also search them. Let's say I want to search for a series of repeated notes. Unisons, that is, represented by the number 1. Right? The JRP returns a complete score with highlighted matches. À cheval, tout homme à cheval, in all 3 voices, right? And this is just incredibly cool, and I have to say that all the credit goes to Craig Sapp for this. Back to the work page. At the left, you'll find a series of analytical tools useful for exploring the music. Now, if you don't read notes, you might enjoy the piano roll function, which displays the score as a kind of abstract graph. You can see how each voice is in a different color. You can see all those repeated notes at the beginning as the voices sing à cheval in turn, and you can see a moment of significant activity followed by a moment of stasis. Let's listen to a recording. Back to the work page again. Here is another way of visualizing musical features in the absence of notation. This activity plot, as we call it, is effectively a timeline of the piece. In every measure, it shows how many distinct notes are sung, taking all the voices together. Thus, you can see, for à cheval, that as the voices first enter, there is an increase in activity. This culminates in the flurry of motion before the cadence, the musical comma or period, where things flatten out before ramping up again. Now, all the analytical tools I've been talking about can be run not only on individual pieces, but on the repertory as a whole. Let's say I want to search the music for the intervallic pattern shown here, the opening of not Josquin's, but Madonna's Like a Virgin. I get search results like this that include a miniature graph of each score showing where the hits are. From here, I can dig into the results, tracking appearances of this pattern across the repertory. Now you have a sense for what the JRP does. It curates fully browsable scores in formats that facilitate comparison with one another and with original sources. It lets you search individual works and the whole repertory for musical patterns, and it lets you run various kinds of analyses to better understand how the music works. I'll stop sharing here and say that in keeping with the theme of this conference, I want to say a word about collaboration. To make this project happen, we've enlisted some wonderful students to transcribe the music. Other students have used our data for statistical analysis. But let me also be a bit provocative and say that when it comes to collaborative projects, more is not necessarily more. Craig and I have probably done 95% of the work ourselves. The real magic, I'd say, comes from applying Craig's technical expertise to a repertory I can interpret from a musicological perspective. With that in mind, I want to say something about how the JRP is used in scholarship. It's not just choir directors and lay people who visit the site. I regularly browse the JRP in the car and at the beach. Indeed, scholars marshal the JRP's resources as we edit pieces of music for publication, as we try to get a better handle on how compositional style changes over time, and as we address problems of authorship. There are big problems of attribution surrounding Josquin's music This was in fact the impetus for the project in its earliest phase. I also use JRP scores for performances like the one I played earlier. Some of us also use the JRP in teaching. On Monday, the students in my music history survey will give brief presentations, having searched the JRP for musical patterns that occur only once, and for the longest pattern they can find that occurs at least 10 times. The goal is to get them exploring the JRP and engaging with the details of the music. Now, there are pieces on this site that are nowhere else transcribed, and there is certainly enough music here to facilitate meaningful insights. At the same time, we've really only scratched the surface, both in how much music we curate and the tools we've created to explore it. But hey, we've only been at it for a decade. We're not quite done horsing around. Thank you.
I think we can continue, and I believe we're going to Emiliano.
Thanks very much, Patrick, for this kind introduction, and thanks, Jesse, for your presentation, and also for being a source of inspiration for my own project. So one of the distinctive features of the Italian madrigal is that it is as much about poetry as it is about music. Composers would often respond to the literary taste of their milieus by engaging in sophisticated renditions of poems by notable authors, ranging from Petrarch to Marino. This poetry often had a distinguished textual tradition of its own, being widely disseminated through literary manuscripts and prints, even before it was set to music. But this strong literary component is often underrepresented in critical editions of the madrigal repertoire. These are typically devoted to the works of single composers, as opposed to settings of the same poetry by multiple musicians, and feature critical apparatuses that rarely engage with the complex textual traditions of the poems set to music. This approach to making critical editions of Italian madrigals is a function also of the limitations of the printed medium, which typically does not allow for complex apparatuses, and has historically been resistant to collaboration across disciplines, more specifically collaboration between musicologists and literary scholars. Drawing on the possibilities afforded by digital encoding, the Tasso Music Project, the first complete edition of the early modern musical settings of poetry by Torquato Tasso, provides a different approach to editing Italian madrigals and related genres. Indeed, the project is poet-centered and devotes equal attention to the musical and poetic domains, thanks also to collaboration between music and literary scholars. The goal of this presentation is to provide an overview of the repertoire under consideration and, most importantly, to illustrate the digital features that allow users of the project fully to appreciate the interdisciplinary nature of its repertoire. These features include musical and literary encodings, as well as tools for the analysis of music-text relations. Now, the protagonist of the project, Torquato Tasso, was arguably the most prominent poet of late 16th century Italy. His poems circulated widely across Europe and rapidly became a source of inspiration for composers, resulting in the production of over 750 settings. Composers include the virtuosi like Marcin and Verdi, but also amateur composers. As is typical with repertoire from this period, however, most of these settings, over 3/4, have been unavailable in modern editions. As a result, this significant corpus has remained largely unexplored in both scholarship and performance, which has in turn hindered a serious assessment of Tasso's influence on early modern musical culture. Now, to make this repertoire available to the scholarly and to the performance community, the project provides open access to newly made critical editions of the musical settings. These are encoded in Handrum, which is the same encoding system used also by the Josquin Research Project, and of which Craig Sapp is the foremost expert. But they're also available for consultation and download in a variety of electronic encodings and renderings, such as MEI, Music XML, MuseData, MIDI, PDF, and MP3. The goal is to make this repertoire as widely accessible as possible. The scores are also rendered dynamically on the web through Verovio, a newly developed SVG system for the visualization of music online, which also allows for interactive notational features. You can see some of those in the slide. Some of these features include part extraction, switching back and forth between modern and original clefs and mensuration signs, removing the lyrics, collapsing the full score to an incipit, and transposition. This latter feature is especially useful for singers who want to use these editions for the purposes of performance. But thanks to humdrum encoding and to the dynamic rendering of the scores online via Verovio, the work pages feature also musical and textual search tools, some of which are inspired by the Josquin research project. And these features facilitate analytical engagements with the pieces. In the slide, for instance, you may see a vertical sonority search. This is a brand new feature, which is especially useful for this repertoire in which vertical sonorities play an increasingly important role. And as Jesse has pointed out for the Josquin project, also in our project, you can run these searches also at the repertory level, so not just by individual piece. But besides this rich musical component, there is an equally substantial literary side to the project. More specifically, we provide transcriptions of the poetic texts as they appear in musical sources and in contemporaneous literary manuscripts and prints. The transcriptions are encoded in TEI, which is a standard encoding system for literary texts, using a schema developed by Raffaele Viglianti at the University of Maryland. Variant readings across sources are marked up and displayed online dynamically. You may see in the slides highlighted the portions of a poem for which we have variant readings. This feature facilitates a real-time assessment of the textual tradition in a way that would not be possible in the printed medium, or at least not as visually compelling, thus catering to the research interests not only of music historians, but also of literary scholars and linguists. For instance, music historians may use it to assess possible filiations or lack thereof between settings of the same poem. Likewise, literary scholars and linguists may track the dissemination and transformation of these poetic texts from one source to another. And this is especially important for a poet like Tasso, who revised his work multiple times in a rather obsessive fashion, and whose works traveled quite widely across musical and literary sources. Finally, still highlighting the interdisciplinary nature of the repertoire, the project features several humdrum-enabled analytical tools with an emphasis on music-text relationships. For instance, in the slide, you may see a text extraction tool, which allows users to visualize the text as it appears in the underlay of the settings with automatic word count. And through this tool, one can see the importance of word repetition in this repertoire. In other words, you can quickly visualize what music does to a poem. It expands it, it even deforms it, zooming in, lingering on certain words or phrases. Likewise, we have a melisma tool through which you can track the occurrence of melismatic writing across the repertoire. This is especially useful for the pieces that we're working on because virtuosic singing becomes more and more prominent. In fact, what you see here is a Ferrarese piece, very virtuosic, Ferrara being one of the foremost centers for this new type of singing. And so to conclude, through its content as well as through its digital setup, the Tasso Music Project addresses a wide audience encompassing music historians and theorists, literary scholars, linguists, performers, and more generally anyone with an interest in the intersection of poetry and music. In addition, the project provides a new model for editions of Italian madrigals, one that restores the centrality of poetry in this repertoire. It also offers a model for the possible integration of music and textual encoding in a single platform, which could be adopted for editions also of other vocal repertoires, including opera and lieder. Thank you.
Thank you, Emiliano. And now we're moving forward chronologically to deal with the repertoire of Chopin, and it's Marcin, I believe.
Thank you. It's great to see you all here. So I will say a few words about Fryderyk Chopin Institute. the beginning, because some of you may not know about whom we are and what are we doing. We are a research and cultural institute devoted to the heritage of Fryderyk Chopin. It was established in 2001 by the Polish government, and we focused in our research mainly on Chopin's music, but since some time we are also working a lot on heritage of Polish music. Well, let me say a few words about history of Polish music at the beginning, because I think it might be an interesting information for you that in terms of archival material that we have in Poland, one must say that we lost about half during Second World War. So 48% of all our manuscripts, prints, and so on, especially those containing early music, were lost during the Second World War. Well, this is something like a law that every time you meet some people from Poland, they always complain about their losses during World War, so I had to do it. So now we are realizing two digitization and research projects which are EU funded. First, it started in 2018. It's Chopin Heritage in Open Access. So in the frames of this project, you are digitizing mainly our own archive, and we are preparing not only scans that we are going to share with everyone for free, but also we are preparing humdrum scores of whole Chopin music. And for every single work, we are preparing at least 3 versions. I'll say a few words about that later. And the second project, which is also EU funded, is called Heritage of Polish Music in Open Access. And this project is focused on Polish music from 16th to 19th century. We are going to digitize more than 20,000 objects like manuscripts and prints, and will publish at least 6,000 scores encoded in humdrum. Not so bad, I must say, but this is possible thanks to our collaboration with Sapp, of course, and a huge group of people that are supporting us and that are creating digital editions. Just a few words about some possibilities that the system have. I mean, the system which uses humdrum encodings. So we, in our Chopin projects, as I said, we are encoding every single work at least in 3 versions. They are based in this project only on printed editions. We are going to work on Chopin's Chopin manuscripts later, not this time. And every single work is based on separate edition. So the system allows us to automatically compare the versions and shows and highlights the differences between them, which is very interesting for Chopin scholars, but it also works in our second project. In first case, in Chopin project, it allows us to show the differences between different editions, but in the second project, it allows us to produce automatically critical reviews. So it means that when we prepare a score, we prepare something like a diplomatic transcription. Then we create an editorial version, and then by comparing them, we can generate automatically generate the list of all changes between the source and editorial version. When working on Polish Heritage Music project, we had to create a special workflow for so many people collaborating with each other, and that's why we created a special system that allows them automatically exchange the files, compare them, and work on them. So this is only a print screen from the system. As you can see, it shows who's working on which edition, when the data was entered, and how many notes it contains. I must say that in a year, we were able to prepare editions containing more than 1.5 million notes, which is quite, I think, good example of collaborative work, and shows that this kind of system works. We also, I will not focus on this, but let me show one more thing. We are also using a file version control system and issue management, which is similar to GitHub. Some of you might have heard about GitHub. So every file we create in our project is put into this system. It keeps all possible versions of every file. And what's more, it allows to track issues, which is very useful in terms of, for example, discussing specific problems with specific sources. As you can see, people can put their comments on sources, ask questions, and so on. So basically, this is how we work, and well, I think that's all for now, and maybe we'll be able to discuss some specific issues later. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcin. And now we're going to move to Daniel, who will talk about the first non-composer specific project. This is the Polyrhythm project.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm just going to try to set up the screen share. So this is the Polyrhythm project that I've been fortunate enough to work on over the past few years with Poudrier and Craig Sapp, who seems to have some connection to all of these projects. And this is the Polyrhythm website. If anyone is interested, it's polyrhythm.humdrum.org. And if you'd like to play with any of the scores or check anything out, like some of the things that I will be talking about, it is password protected with Polyrhythm, and then the password is cracker. The idea being that Poly wants a cracker. I believe that's the joke. At the heart of this research is this idea of entrainment. One of the most widely observed responses to music listening is this spontaneous moving of one's head or a foot along with the beat. This is linked to an almost unique human ability to detect regularity in auditory signals, an ability that plays an essential role in the communication of emotion and meaning in music. And just this idea of synchrony can be related to aspects of social bonding. They find that if you dance in sync in kind of these silent disco paradigms, if you dance in sync with others, you're more likely to have some sort of affiliative behavior with them and kind of be more altruistic. There's this real kind of human nature to entraining to a beat. And this is kind of the heart of the research context of the Polyrhythm project. Two fundamental properties of rhythmic regularity are that it provides pleasure and that it promotes joint action, which kind of contributes to this social cohesion. So we're left with this kind of weird juxtaposition in our research question, in that we know that social cohesion is facilitated by an ability to entrain, an ability to kind of sync up with a beat. And yet musical cultures around the world are characterized by extremely complex rhythmic patterns that are often actually quite difficult to entrain to. For example, this is, I don't know what kind of metal it is, but this is Meshuggah, which is very difficult to entrain to. I think this is one of Ev's go-to slides of a musical act that is actually quite difficult to entrain to. So we have these research questions. Why do human beings engage in the creation and performance of complex rhythms? And what characteristics of the human experience, what characterizes the human experience of these complex rhythms? And this is what led to this large project about modeling the polyrhythmic experience. This is a collaborative project based on the Sutter corpus. It's this 1980 dissertation. It's this multi-volume dissertation where he categorizes a lot of different types of polyrhythms and a lot of different examples. And we didn't want to be the ones to kind of pick what was polyrhythmic and what wasn't. So we were very lucky and fortunate that there was this person who had already done this work. It identifies structural features of a wide variety of polyrhythms, and it investigates the motor, cognitive, and affective correlates of rhythmic complexity. And our project explores this kind of stylistic development, including aspects of musical production. At the heart of this project is a close study of musical scores. We are music theorists and music analysts, and we do love to do this close reading of music scores, but we also love to do this kind of broader corpus analysis. So we've built this corpus, again, all with Humdrum and all in kind of Kern format, flat text files. And we've been working on computational analysis of these pieces. We've also been using these as kind of stimuli in behavioral experiments to kind of see what musical features might be predictive of perceived emotion, perceived complexity, and things like that. And another kind of prong of the study is, much like a lot of these studies have discussed, accessibility to this data. And that means making the data available, but also kind of a web-based data visualization that allows you to kind of do exploratory work on your own. At the heart of a lot of this, we're very aware of kind of the perils of distant readings and kind of corpus studies. And I think one of the projects that I'll skip ahead to that. One of my favorite quotes is from Arthur Mendel, where he writes that since Professor Lockwood and I first began our flirtation with the computer some years ago, we have more than once been warned by our respective colleagues in these discouraging words. Any question the computer can answer is not worth asking. We are still trying to find out whether they were right. And he then goes on to say that elements of style are complex entities. One only begins to realize how complex when one tries to identify them in terms so unambiguous that the computer can identify them. This is extremely true with polyrhythm. We realize just how difficult and how complex this question is as we try to turn it into things that we can analyze with a computer. And so I think that something that this project has a lot in connection with the previous studies discussed today is that it is about a marriage of a computational method and a close reading and a musicological analysis. And we've been working on how these corpus studies and these distant readings can inform a close reading, basically. So this corpus has 724 examples extracted from 450 works by 20 composers from Europe and America, basically ranging from 1877 to 1969. And it's from this dissertation from 1980 by Louis-Marc Sutter. It's geocoded by premiere location. So this is a still image, but if you were to watch this video, it's pretty cool. You can kind of see the timeline of all of the premieres happening. And here's a word cloud of basically what the data set includes: premiere location, conductor, composer, and the premiere orchestra. And so basically, there are certain kind of composers that are less represented, like Gershwin only has 7 pieces, whereas Marcin has 62. That's for works, but in terms of examples, Martinu, the Czech composer, has 76 pieces in this, and on average about 36 examples per composer. So that's the current corpus that we're working with. This was kind of developed, this corpus was developed with Craig Sapp at Stanford, and we have this searchable database with data visualization tools. Through kind of the larger encoding of both Ev and myself and this kind of army of research assistants, we have a lot of measures of coded musical data and a lot of recorded and synthesized music that matches up to each example. This is what the main website looks like if you were to go to it and sort it by composer or piece, or when it was premiered, or when it was composed, or when it was published. And in the future, again, we're hoping that this complements kind of this close study. It kind of extends to this behavioral work of that looks at the human experience, and it provides a framework of tools for rhythm analysis. We've actually found that just in asking these questions, we've had to kind of create a lot of tools that we didn't have before that kind of look at elements of kind of stream segregation of certain rhythms, or kind of modeling rhythmic complexity, etc. And we have this searchable database, which goes back to accessibility with this musical and experiential data visualization that we hope will kind of generate public interest and can kind of help. There's a large team behind this led by Ev, and I'm kind of along for the ride. We have this team of collaborators of Nori, Craig, and George Sanatakis, and a team of research assistants. I also want to say that this, kind of like a couple of the other projects here, this project is really only possible because we're able to work with these research assistants who can easily access the data and play with the data in Verovio Humdrum Viewer. And that has kind of really sped everything up. So kind of from that perspective, I think I'm just going to, we have this nice transition where we go straight into this talk on Verovio Humdrum Viewer. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So now we're going to turn to Craig.
So firstly, not very many people know it, but I'm presenting from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who were the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula in California. And I've been to a few of the previous presentations in the conference, and I've been to UBC. So, but it'd be interesting that probably like Jesse and people like that have no idea about that. And they do say that they have not ceded any lands. So just to be in the theme of the conference. So the first thing I wanted to show is, in general, I just wanted to show you this generalized tool that's very useful for all the projects and commons. So you kind of have interfaces for different types of repertories and different purposes, but then underneath, you often it's nice to have tools that are common and you can reuse them for different projects. So in this case, I've been working especially with the Chopin Institute on the Verovio Humdrum Viewer, and also collaborating with Laurent Poujan in Switzerland, who's the main creator of Verovio. And so I'm basically creating an interface that interacts the text with the graphical notation. So in musical, I guess in performances, for musicians, you look at the music on the right, where you can see the graphical notation, and this is like been around for about 1,000 years, this sort of notation, with various changes over the centuries. But it's not something the computer can like interact with directly, not maybe for another 100 years until you get very good like vision sensing for the computers. But on the left, you have a textual form of the graphical music, which can be processed by the computer. So this is kind of the underlying data format for all the projects. And then this editor makes it much more efficient than dealing with like a plain text editor where you don't see the graphics. And so I would say it's like, yeah, infinitely faster than like when we started with the JOSCAN project. So you have graphical editors in music, but they usually hide the kind of the digital score of the music. Whereas if you're doing research, you need access to it. So even like Finale, which is a very commonly used music editor, they basically would try to threaten to sue anyone who published their data format like 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so starting 20 years ago, there's Music XML, which made things more accessible, but then like getting all the fine details right is very complex because musical data is much more complex than textual data. So here's a short example of a humdrum data with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. So in this case, the musical time goes from top to bottom, and then things that are on the row are occurring at the same time. So it's equivalent to rotating the notation by 90 degrees. And so I kind of show the similarity between the scores. And then recently I've even added a spreadsheet-like interface to Verovio, where you can actually edit the music in a spreadsheet. So it's very similar to music notation. The only difference is it's rotated 90 degrees. And then I'd like to point out that all of the data for all the projects that are mentioned are online. And in particular, you can go to the scores scores menu in Verovio Humdrum Viewer And it's the bottom 4 options right now. So you can see all the data, or nearly all the data for all the projects here. And then all the projects will eventually be on GitHub, but here's some examples that are already on GitHub. So this is very useful for collaborating with people, especially across the internet when you're not close to each other. So it's ideal for COVID era. And it's also useful to keep track of all the changes, and then people from the community can report on these repositories if they find problems, and then you can fix it, or they can also help to fix it directly. So it's very nice for collaborative editing. And it's also nice just to point out you have kind of the data, which is separate from the interface. So mostly these previous presentations deal with interfaces to the data. And these are like the core data that people can use for other purposes like analysis. So that's all that I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. I believe we have one question, Vicky.
Yeah, we do have one question from Janet, and I see you're here, so I wanted to it might be more natural if you just unmute and just ask the question directly.
Okay, I'll ask it, but it'll be basically the same thing as I wrote. So I wanted to know, I've been poking around in JRP for quite a while, and it's very, very impressive in terms of usability. It's user-friendly, and from my experience, it's more user-friendly and accessible than the vast majority of other MIR tools that I have come across. So I was curious that during the collaborative work that you talked about, if you involved any user testing or feedback from users, because I know that in general, user information needs and user behaviors in general are still very much overlooked in the field of MIR tool development. And I just wondered if JRP was somehow different regarding that.
So do you want me to talk about it, Jesse, or do you want to?
Why don't you say something and then I'll see if I have anything to add, yeah.
Well, the first thing is that, yeah, so what happens is I don't care about user interfaces. I want to do stuff like I'm the MI person. And so basically I work with Jesse, so he says what he wants, and then we kind of negotiate, say, well, that's too hard, or okay, I'll do that, but I can see how it's useful, so I'll do extra effort to get what you want. And then we also worked in particular with a user interface specialist and a web designer at the beginning, or not at the beginning, but probably at the second year. And so we got funding to pay like not a music person, but a general web interface person. So she would walk through it with Jesse, and then he said basically how he wanted to react. So there was a lot of back and forth with him and the user interface designer. And then there's always, like every little teeny thing, we have to negotiate each other, because like I say, why do you want that? And do you really want that? And because I'm not going to do it unless you really want it. And so that's probably one of the keys, is that with MAR, usually it's the people who build the tools who are kind of running things. Whereas in this case, like I want to just minimize that total work, because I know that if it's not going to be used, it's going to like be unmaintainable and kind of decay. So that's kind of my point of view on how it works.
Yeah, no, that's all right. First of all, thanks for the observation. I mean, I'm so glad to hear it's user friendly. We really worked hard on that. And what Craig says is absolutely right. And I guess I just add that, I mean, I'm always someone who complains about really anything on the web. I just find it incredible how little attention seems to be paid to the experience of someone who's not already an expert. So that's like a starting point, thinking from the perspective of, as like someone who teaches undergraduates, for instance, but also that maybe to add that, especially in the early years of the project, when there were a lot of students involved, not a lot, but like my undergraduate students, graduate students, people floating around, that we just kind of, as we develop tools, we put it in front of people to sort of get, and my question is always, what do you have to complain about? I don't care that you like something. I want to know what's wrong. That's the only way to make anything better. And so from the beginning, having the ethos of like, how do we make this so that it's not, it doesn't blind people with science. And it is this tension though, because the more, there are questions I want to ask of the data that I can't ask on the JRP, because it would either it would take too much of Craig's time, or even if it's not hard to put it up there as a query, it just makes the search too complex looking. And so there's always that tension, and we struggle with that. I think that's inevitable. But no, the goal really has been throughout to sort of just make it possible to use it and not bang your head against the wall.
Yeah, because kind of related to that. So certain things are like very easy on the command line. It's like, but to get it on the web, some things are even totally impractical once you get to a certain level of complexity, because like the web is still developing the technology. So if you implement things, it's going to be decaying in a few years anyway. So if you have to invest a lot of time getting it on and it's fragile, then you're kind of wasting your time. So there is kind of a progression of how much you can get on the web at any point. So over time, it's getting more and more possible to do more and more complex things. So like the Tasso and Music project is kind of extending the technologies that are currently in JawScan. So the problem that I'm going to have to end up dealing with is now I have to go back and retrofit JawScan with the new technologies. And that's extremely boring to retrofit old websites to do new things, because it's more fun to just do new websites with new things. So that's another consideration.
Trying to convince Craig it's worth it. I think he knows, but it is a pain.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Great, thank you. Now I know that you have identified a couple of areas that you're hoping to cover in this opportunity for discussion. One of them is around community building through cultural preservation and research dissemination. I mean, my first exposure to this kind of project was in the 1980s when I was in a class of Barry Brook with French manuscripts, you know, which was, it certainly built a community amongst his graduate students who were the grunts doing the work on this project. So how do you see the development of community around this, the cultural preservation component?
Yeah, this would probably be good for Emiliano and perhaps Marcin.
Yeah. So I work on madrigals, and as I said, madrigals are as much about poetry as they are about music. And I think historically, one of the issues that we've had is that the true scholarly communities don't really talk to each other, because we're busy with our respective work, of course. And so, one of the things that I've tried to do with this project is precisely to bring these true scholarly communities together. And it's been challenging, I have to say. First of all, because as Jesse pointed out, the more is not necessarily the better. So when you have a lot of people to manage, things can get quite taxing, of course. But at the same time, it's been rewarding, because I think musicologists do need the expertise of literary scholars, and vice versa. So as a result, we now have a group of people who were previously unaware of one another, and now we're working together. So it's been a nice process of growth, so to speak, but definitely quite challenging. So collaboration is productive when things go well, but it's also taxing at the same time.
Also, I'll point out that we're looking for a digital humanities, like computational scholar who's interested in it, or who knows Italian and who's interested maybe in studying poetry and how it relates to music, to add to a grant that Emiliano will be filling in this month, or this coming month. So if any of you are interested or know someone who's hopefully knows Italian and then is interested in poetry and maybe how to analyze it with music, so you maybe get in contact with Emiliano.
Please do.
We did have one more question in the chat if we have time. It was for any of the presenters. It's just if there are any interests outside of memorization that you would like to speak to.
Could you clarify? Sorry, just wondering if you could say a little more about that. What do you mean outside of memorization?
That was the question. Maybe I can invite the person who asked the question to unmute and just provide a bit more clarification. Thanks, Evan.
Yeah. Sorry, memorialization. So I was just wondering, outside of just preserving this material, is there interest that any of the presenters have hopes for that this data could be used for, like some project futuristic sort of thing that combines this past sort of thing, or if there's any dreams that could transcend just preservation? Thanks.
Well, I don't know if anybody, I mean, I guess I would I would push back a little bit about just preservation in the sense that preservation is a core element of it. But like to take our project, for instance, the point is precisely to facilitate new ways of approaching old materials, right? So the whole kind of interaction that we're hoping to facilitate is one, first of all, that takes place in a different, in a digital domain that has nothing to do, with the experience of our forebears, but also, that could lead to questions you didn't even know you had about material that has, impacts, I think, I know in my own case, for performance practice, for the way people engage with the stuff more generally, for people's ability to push notes around, all this stuff. And I think also that it is what Craig has done with the JRP, I think, is a model for visualization of musical material more generally, right? Like that this approach of encoding, searchability is transferable to any notated repertory. So actually it really fans out potentially to, as in many directions.
And also there's kind of a spectrum of projects here. So in terms of preservation, like the Chopin Institute is probably the main focus in this set, because they're trying to kind of collate all of these dispersed editions around Poland from different libraries. And they've always been disrupted by various people invading their country. So they don't have a very coherent set of repertoire like you have for German music. So it is old music, but it hasn't been curated in any like coherent sense because of their history. And then with JustScan, it's not about preservation, it's about analysis and kind of using it as a tool maybe for creating like editions. And then Emiliano's is kind of halfway between that. So he is preserving in a sense, because a lot of these editions were not, they're not modern editions. So he's been kind of bringing the old editions and transcribing them for modern users. And then I guess the Polyrhythm project is very different because it's more about music cognition. So how do you think about music? So it's not preservation at all in that sense, because they're just using the music as a tool to like study human behavior. So each kind of project has a different focus on what they're doing.
Yeah, also, I would say that when we talk about preservation, we think of something static, especially in the printed context. You make an edition of a piece and that's it. But these pieces, the poems in my case, and the music as well, they have a very dynamic history behind them. They change substantially over time from source to source. And I think one of the things that you can do in the digital domain that it's hard to do in the printed medium is precisely to render, how dynamic the history of these pieces is. So it's inherently more interactive, more dynamic, and therefore more engaging, I think, for audiences at large.
And maybe Marcin could talk about. So what we saw was basically the digitization, which is similar to that project, but they're also scanning the music. So there'll be an integration of the digital score with the original scans, which takes a lot of work, which he's noticing, I'm sure. So we don't have that for the Tasso, because that's like too complicated, because you have multiple libraries involved. So over time, they're putting more and more materials online. So it'll become easier and easier to do these things as like independent researchers. So you can basically access the data through the libraries. So most of these projects are not library oriented, except the Chopin Institute. And so they're more looking at the content in like the scans. So the libraries deal with the preservation, and then the researchers want to use it to do basically comparisons between different repertories and doing more dynamic activities with the data extracted from the scores.
Yes, thanks, Greg. So the first problem with preservation is that, as I already said, we lost almost half of all our archival material, and what is lost is and what is left is rather random. So it's not very representative for specific periods in Polish history, music history. So the other thing is that our history was even more complex than people can think. So because, for example, in 19th century, there was no Poland, we were under partition, so we're not able to work on our earlier heritage. Then there were two world wars, and after that, 50 years of communism. So we were not able, for example, to work on sacred music, which was, you know, not very politically correct to work on sacred music, for example. And the majority of Polish musical heritage is sacred music because it was left in church archives that were not burned, like, for example, National Library in 1944. So we have other problems than for example, Emiliano or people who are working on history of music in Germany. But we are trying in this project not only to preserve what we have, but to disseminate it as widely as possible. That's why we're using APIs to connect to most important, you know, databases and repositories like Wikimedia, MSLP, Zenodo, which is a very interesting tool, and Opener, and so on. So we want all this, you know, whole material that is digitized and prepared as transcribed digital editions to be downloadable, not only from our website, but also automatically put to those repositories. The other thing is that we are not storing metadata to all the materials locally. We always try to create metadata in remote repositories like RISM, for example, and VIAF. So we are using VIAF for control vocabulary, and RISM is the place where we catalog all the sources, and then we just, you know, take the data from RISM and connect it to the scans and then to the digital editions. So this is basically how we do it.
I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the development of digital technologies, because I noticed with something like Verovio, that's obviously developed out of this need to look at the background encoding as well as the musical score. Do you see a lot of future developments in this area as well?
I think there will be more and more developments. So at the moment, like if you look at Finale and Sibelius, the very common musical editors, they're very much geared towards musicians who are not interested in that sort of thing. And it's even in the newer free ones like MuseScore, it's almost always the digital data is hidden from the user. So, but there's the MEI group, some music encoding initiative. They're much more into the scholarly use of like the digital text. And at the moment, there's no commercial entity really interested in dealing with that. So one problem is music notation is very complex and it's very costly to do, and usually you have to deal with the commercial programming. So what I'm doing is kind of as good as you can get with the current tools. And like, I don't expect this to be like, I'm not going to like spend all my time working on this interface. And I know in the future it'll be replaced, but hopefully people like use it and understand what needs to be done. And so there's other people who are very similar, interested in sort of thing, and they're also very competitive with each other. So it's kind of hard for them to collaborate because different music data formats are like a religion basically. So you have different formats, and some people, they're very complex, so they only know one format. And they don't like another format, mostly because they don't understand the other format. And particularly, they don't really study the other format. So that's one general problem. So the general overall problem is like text is like one-dimensional. So it's fairly simple. So you have HTML, web pages, kind of pretty much solve the problem. But then with music, it's two-dimensional. So you have much more complex interactions between the graphical elements. And just like getting the manpower to do that correctly is like very expensive. And so it's more expensive than it's possible with like non-commercial users. And so that's the biggest like limitation, I think, in the technology. So it'll always be trailing in other more advanced techniques, like in pure text, for example.
Any other thoughts on where the technology needs to evolve, whether it's this part of the technology or other components to help us pursue our research ideas?
You know, I was thinking that, you know, in the future, it might be nice to see more integration, you know, when it comes to, you know, to music encoding and encoding of other types of text, you know, verbal texts or even images for that matter, you know. For instance, in our project, we do use TI and Humdrum, and they're in the same platform, but they don't really interact with each other. So in the future, it might be nice, you know, to integrate the two, or also, you know, think of, you know, a possible, you know, edition of operas where you might want to integrate the textual component, the musical, and also the visual if you want to reproduce like an, you know, the original staging and the likes. So it might be interesting to see that happen. But as Craig pointed out, music is somewhat resistant to that because of, you know, the complications that are inherent in the subject matter.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons Verovio seems kind of exciting in that you know, the ability to grab something and search for it in a fairly fluid, dynamic way is really appetizing. I mean, right as we speak, I'm finishing a little article on Josquin's mensural practice, the way Josquin uses time signatures in his music, basically. And to do this, I've relied heavily on the JRP, but there's a fair amount of just scrolling through stuff. And, you know, if I could like highlight and drag something and then see every instance of that thing, right? I mean, you end up in a situation where typing out a search, Craig could do, but with the existing search tools, I can't quite do what I'm looking to do. So I have to just basically turn the pages of the scores. Again, infinitely easier than it would have been 50 years ago, given everything. But, you know, I could imagine going forward that this ability to more dynamically choose parameters for evaluation with a tool like Verovio will lead to, you know, more powerful insights and the quicker sorting through of materials.
And that's also integrated with user interfaces. And that's one of the problems is you want development to get improved technology, but then the problem is when things develop, then the old software breaks and then you have to redo everything. So it's good to have development, but it's also horrendous to have development. So they go together.
So in terms of this development, though, I'm wondering how these projects relate to the older type of scholarly project in this area, which would be a collected edition. So now you have the collected edition with a certain scholarly apparatus around it, and these projects have a rich underpinning that you can dig into, but how do we create a standard for what this will be in relation to the needs of scholars?
Well, the problem is with the standard is there are people working on that. But the problem is it's kind of like early printing. So everyone has their own ideas. So I think it just takes time. You have competing people who develop these tools. And as people use them, they'll find, oh, this one works better than this one. So it's kind of like Google versus AltaVista. So maybe most of you maybe don't know of AltaVista, but they started before Google and I was using them before Google, but then I heard, oh, this Google, which was created by people from Stanford. So it has no advertising on the homepage and it was much faster. So Google won out. So it's not, so the problem is if you'll have people are kind of competing at the moment. So like with MIDI, it was kind of a similar situation. So you had people in the 70s working with electroacoustic music and they wanted to hook synthesizers together and they found it was more beneficial to work together. So people would buy their equipment and hook other people's equipment to it. So at some point, if it's beneficial for people to collaborate, they will collaborate. But if they don't see it beneficial, they'll just do it their own way. And there's kind of a mix of both in like music technology at the moment. So there are people who want to collaborate, but then they don't want to collaborate with other people. And it's like I was going to the last presentation and they're talking about these standards for Canada. So like, are you guys like working with America to do standards or you want to be independent? Like I know you do. Or do you want to collaborate with Europe, like with Poland? And because Poland and Europe have their own standards for doing a lot of library things. So it's very similar in the library technologies, is you have a lot of people with competing standards because they built it, or it came from their country. And so they'd be reluctant to lose it to switch over to another system. But over time, it'll probably, the most efficient ones or the things that can be maintained the longest will be the ones that went out. So you just have to let the market like decide things in the long term.
Yeah, I have to say that, I find the current status of affairs, productive and exciting in a way, because, all these projects that we've been talking about are very artisanal in a way. Yes, we do use, essentially, humdrum as primary encoding system, but it's been tailored, for the needs of our individual projects, and each of us has been working individually with Craig. So it's very much like, a small workshop, if you will. And I find that very, very rewarding because there is still, this human exchange, this tailor-made experience. Whereas, in a more standardized system, it would be also a little bit more impersonal and less refined, perhaps, even. So, there are shortcomings, I think, but there are also some advantages to this fluidity that we have right now.
I also say, yeah, I would say very true. So one problem I notice in general is that you have people who want to build generalized tools that specific projects would use, but I find that's kind of dangerous to do. So what you want to do is you want to build specific projects so you can understand like what different people need, and then figure out how to generate a generalized like system or tool that can be used in multiple situations. So that's like a very complicated thing. So usually if you're working from a big like corporate or like large conglomerate sort of system, you start with a generalized system you want to be able to use, and so you kind of push from the top down, whereas that's good to do, but you also need a lot of bottom up to figure out like what are the little things that would be very useful to have that maybe the generalized tool they wouldn't think of. And then if it's kind of, you freeze the generalized tool in a certain way, you won't be able to access those sort of functionalities because you're kind of fixed in a certain architecture. So all these projects are basically a lot of bottom-up stuff. There's also top-down stuff, but it kind of like, what is the specific like repertory need? And so like when I work with someone, I say, oh, I can do like all this stuff is kind of common to this other project, but then like with Emiliano, we have to do with all this textual interfaces and interactions. So it's like totally different from Joscan because it makes it a lot more complicated because I don't do text stuff but I can do it, but ideally we'd have someone, so we have like, we had like the Variorum, the textual variants one done by someone else in University of Maryland, so Rafael Viglianti. So probably some of you might know him because he works in this sort of the field of the conference, especially.
So I know another area you were interested in discussing was around the relationship to teaching, learning, how these kind of projects will work with teaching renewal or experiential learning for our students. Someone want to comment on that?
So Ev had a lot on that, so maybe Dan could talk about that.
Yeah, I'll just talk about, there's one project, let's see if I can pull it up, that I just used recently, which I found to be extremely useful in my Theory 1 class, where we basically have Mozart's musical dice game, and I had an assignment where they would go through and they would roll the dice and play the game, and it's been implemented in Verovio and Verovio Humdrum Viewer, where they could then go through and look at actually the piece and then listen to the piece if they clicked on it, and go through actually what was happening. If they look at kind of well-formed pieces or kind of malformed pieces or going in the wrong order. And it led to this wonderful discussion of syntax and what it means to have some sort of harmonic syntax. And it was how I introduced like kind of larger tonal models. So for music theory, I will say that I'm, over the past maybe 6 months or a year, I'm actually able to take, it used to be like my computational research interests and my teaching interests, and they were separate. and I think especially like Verovio has allowed me to kind of have these interactive assignments, kind of combine these two and create prompts in a like more pedagogical way. So I've been quite, like Jesse was saying, like this more kind of interactive back and forth thing of Ferrovio has not only changed research, but I also think it's changing my teaching at least.
Yeah, it makes the students, I guess, interact more with the music in a way that wasn't possible before. So that probably adds interest for them, which makes them in turn learn more.
Yeah, and I think there's a benefit to play, and I think you can play with an interface like that.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, a lot of the students at Stanford in music double major with computer science, just to give them something like this where they can dig into it, start looking at the data behind it, learning the formats and the language. Some of them get into it that way, and then actually take it and run with it. And that's pretty cool. To the, maybe I could say something just to the last point that's obvious, but that there is, it's really important, I think, always to ask the question, what am I looking at, and how high of a quality is what I'm looking at, right? Like, and what is its purpose? Because, for example, our data, we all obsess over the quality of our data, which doesn't mean there aren't mistakes, but often we're correcting problems we see in modern editions, just the things that are overlooked, outright mistakes, and at the same time we try to say very explicitly, but don't think this is a replacement for a critical apparatus. Like, you still need to go back to the, if you want to say something concrete, if you want to make conclusions, you have to check. We've in our case, we've only printed one version of the piece. You have to know what else is out there. You have to, in a case like Emiliano's, I think it's more the sense that everything that is out there is on the website, which is pretty amazing. And then you can deal with, and with what Marcin's talking about. And so you can go and control variants, and really sort of, then it starts to include the edition, or just replace it, if there's a published one. But I think those questions are important. You can't just take because it's online, assume it's accurate or it's efficient.
You mentioned attribution as a component of this. How has the research supported your efforts to try and confirm attribution for Josquin?
So just the other day, a colleague emailed a few of us in the Josquin world with a piece that he thinks could be by Josquin for various reasons. And people had different reactions. My reaction was, no way, Jose. But one of the reasons I came to that conclusion was because I read through the piece and saw some things that looked wrong. And having seen those things, I then searched for them in the JRP. And I didn't find them in secure Josquin, right? So right away I can control a hunch. And this is kind of the sort of process that has been really useful. It's not the only one, but as having worked with the sources as a first step, then this sort of comparative stylistic analysis is indispensable to getting a handle on what he does and what he doesn't do, and then using that to make judgments about questionable cases.
Any other questions from the attendees? Great. Well, then I think it's probably time to say thank you very much to our presenters. It was wonderful to hear about your work. It's so diverse and so has so much potential for the future. So we hope that you're all going to keep going and look forward to the future directions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll share the link to the video when it's processed, and I can see even beyond music, some departments where faculty and students would be really interested in your work. Thank you so much.